Hello, BISC1323. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 2.2. We're still in the fungi chapter, so we started this last time. We got through the phylogeny, but we have some more topics to cover, including the ecology of fungi. This means their role in sort of the bigger picture of ecosystems. So before we get into this, just some key terms review. These are all things from BISC 1303: symbiotic relationships and symbiosis, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. I won't read all these out, but you can look them up in the key terms document. Just, refresh yourself of what these all mean. I'm bringing this up because I want to talk about three fungal symbiotic relationships that exist and are important or interesting. One of these is something called mycorrhizae. It's another key term. I will read this one. Mycorrhizae, actually, I'll show you this before we read the key term. So this is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a plant. So you should recognize these fungal hyphae around here. And what we're looking at is the cross section of a plant root structure. So at first glance, this looks pretty gnarly, right? You've got the fungus sort of invading these plant roots with their hyphae. This looks like some sort of horrible parasitic invasion, but it's not. This is, again, I hope that you reviewed these. This is an example of mutualism. This is actually not a parasitic relationship. They both benefit from acting together like this because the fungi are not invading and stealing resources. What the fungi are doing is they're absorbing water and mineral nutrients from the soil with their hyphae. So plant roots, as we'll see when we get to the chapter on plants, the job of a plant root is to absorb water and mineral nutrients from the soil. Plant roots are pretty good at that. Mycelium is better. Fungi are the champions of absorbing stuff around them. So they absorb water and mineral nutrients, but you cannot survive on water and mineral nutrients alone. You need carbon, you need sugars. Well, plants are good at doing photosynthesis and generating sugars. So the fungus receives sugar in payment, and in return, it delivers the stuff it absorbs from the soil to these plants. Plants grow better with this. Not a scientific study, but a good image. Without mycorrhizae, with mycorrhizae, plants love having this sort of partner. If you can also buy, I don't know what makes it premium. You can buy premium mycorrhizae to spread on the roots of your plants in a garden. Plant success, because they grow better with this. So that definition to read from the key terms is a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a plant. Connections between fungal hyphae provide soil minerals to the plant, while plant roots provide carbohydrates to the fungus. Ooh, long key terms definition, but it summarizes pretty much the whole thing. I only want to add to that key terms definition by pointing out that this is incredibly common. Most plants, 90% of all vascular plants are capable of having this relationship, so very widespread. Another fungal symbiotic relationship that is important is lichen. So you don't really see the mycorrhizae because it's all underground, but you definitely see lichen. Even walking around campus, you're going to see most, if not all, of these different types of lichen growing on. Look at the oak trees. Look at some of the rock structures, benches, sides of buildings, stuff like that. You're going to see these things growing. And what this is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus, obviously, and an algal partner. And you may remember the word algae from the protist chapter. I said that it was a very vague, kind of uncertain term, and normally I don't like using vague, uncertain terms, but it works here because this algal partner can be a lot of different things. It could be a plant, it could be a bacterium, so algae is appropriately vague. Don't sweat all the details here, but this is a cross-section of what this lichen looks like. And we can see some familiar structures. We see all these hyphae, we see this mycelium, and then in the middle we see these algal cells. Again, these look like plant cells, but they could be bacterial cells. It's some sort of partner that does photosynthesis. Because just like with mycorrhizae, the downside to fungi is that they need energy. They're not doing photosynthesis, they need some sugars. But what plants are really good at doing, or anything photosynthetic, is building sugars. So the nature of this relationship is that the algae are doing photosynthesis, generating sugars, and feeding that to the fungus. In return, the fungus protects the algae. These cells would normally not be able to survive outside of the water. They wouldn't be able to survive on a rock or on the bark of a tree or branch or something like that. And so this is another example of mutualism. They both benefit by having this partnership together. I think just like the mycorrhizae, a lot of this is just in the key terms definition. Lichen is defined as a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthetic alga. Fungus protects alga, while alga provides carbohydrates to the fungus. And yep, long definition, but it's all there. I'm adding to this by pointing out that the alga, can be a plant or a bacterium. And yeah, the fungus can be an ascomycete or a basidiomycete. We defined what these are in the previous group. But yeah, so there are lots of different fungi that can form lichens, lots of different algae that can be part of lichens as well. All right. There is one more symbiotic relationship that I think is of note, and this is leafcutter ants, or at least leafcutter ants are half of this relationship. So if you look at these ants, yeah, leafcutter ants is probably a pretty good name for these things. They cut off pieces of leaves, and if you see them in the wild, you'll see just a stream of these ants carrying chunks of leaves back to their home for some mysterious purpose. And if you were to just see a bunch of ants carrying leaves back to their home, you'd probably guess, oh, they're going to feed these to their queen, or maybe they're going to feed them to their young, or maybe they're going to save them for winter. I don't know. Well, they're not doing any of those things. What they're doing with these leaves is feeding them to their domesticated fungus. So there's this ball of fungus that exists in their home that breaks down the organic matter of these leaves. And leaves normally very difficult to digest, but fungi are the champions of breaking things down and digesting things. And so they grow this fungus by giving it food, and then they eat some of this fungus. They're not going to eat all of it, but they're going to eat parts of it. This sounds weird, but this is what we do with our crops when we grow plants and then eat some of those plants. This species of fungus is essentially domesticated because it has evolved to be provided leaves, to be provided food. It can't really live very well on its own in the wild, and these ants cannot survive without this fungus either. They have no other source of nutrition. So this is once again what we would call a mutualistic relationship. They both benefit by partnering up like this. So we call these fungus growing ants is what I'm calling this example, because it involves the leafcutter ants that feed these leaves to the fungus. They take care of the fungus and they eat the fungus. It's a domesticated fungus. And this would be another example of mutualism. Now, one last little topic in this fungus chapter, importance of fungi in human life. There's just one statement I want to make about this, and that is some fungi are important model organisms for eukaryotes. So a model organism is some organism that's not a human that you can study in order to learn more about humans. Classically, mice and rats are good model organisms. We test drugs and stuff on them to make sure that they work. But fruit flies are also popular models, and some of these others. We learn more about how we work and how to treat cancer and things like that in these models instead of testing on straight humans. Fungi don't sound like they would be a very good model for understanding humans because these fungi are so different from humans. But at the end of the day, these are still eukaryotes. They have a nucleus and their cells behave very similarly to the way our cells behave. A lot of very basic biology stuff about how internal cell processes work can be understood using yeast, using fungi as a way to understand how they work in all other eukaryotes, how they work in humans in particular. The key terms definition of a model organism is a species that researchers study and use as a model to understand the biological processes in other species represented by the model organism. And yeah, I'm not calling out any particular species names, but there are several fungi that are important in this role. Okay, that brings us to the end of the fungus chapter, but we are not done with this recorded lecture. We're going to move on now from fungus to the first of several plant chapters. So if we're talking about plants, let's get a couple of things out of the way first. Back to this fun thing. Remember, plants were part of this supergroup Archaeoplastida. All three of these things are what we consider to be plants. This is an ancestor and all of its descendants. So kingdom Plantae, as it's called, is a nice, clean, monophyletic group. Plants are photoautotrophs, another callback to a few chapters ago. It's in the key terms again for you to review. They make their own organic compounds from inorganic carbon, and they get their energy from sunlight. And importantly, these plants are distinct from other things that kind of look like plants, from red algae or brown algae, which are protists, because they have different pigments in their photosynthesis. They superficially resemble one another. That's convergent evolution, but they are distinct from these not plants and actually plants. So what could we, not plants, plants. So what can we say about plants? Well, this was a convenient phylogenetic tree for looking at all eukaryotes, but I think we need to focus in on a more specific one if we want to look specifically at plants, because we can expand this quite a bit. Here's a useful one showing plants, and right off the bat, plant ancestor. Again, it's a monophyletic group. Right off the bat, one of the things we notice about this phylogenetic tree is that it kind of looks like a staircase. And I think this is convenient because what this means is we can introduce the oldest plants, the simplest plants, and what we're going to do is build up evolutionary innovations. We're going to add new capabilities. We're going to add new features. We're going to add new things until we get to the more complicated plants that have all sorts of fun evolutionary bells and whistles. So let's start with the statement here that the earliest plants, the most basic plants, are called green algae. So that includes two divisions, and yep, I know you memorized the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, all that stuff on the first lecture, but yeah, sometimes these things are just called divisions. It's just an extra taxon. But these two, chlorophyta and charophyta, are kind of lumped together into this division called green algae. Again, the earliest plants, and they are indeed aquatic, which makes sense. If you're doing photosynthesis and you need water, it's easiest to live in the water. And chlorophytes and charophytes are these two groups of green algae. There are some differences between chlorophytes and charophytes, but honestly, I don't think it's worth trying to hammer down. Here are some chlorophytes. You don't have to memorize these, but some of them look kind of planty. Some of them are microscopic. Some of them are single-celled. This is really weird. We're not going to see too many single-celled plants as we get out of green algae. And here are some charophytes. And once again, you got some single-celled members. You got some that look more like typical plants. But yeah, we kind of just lump these two together and call them green algae. And notably, some members are unicellular, but that's the last time we're going to see that. Okay, so water is a good place to start if you're photosynthetic, being aquatic. But plants did not stay in the water. Plants wanted to make it to land. There are several advantages to life on land. One of these is that there's less competition. We don't think of plants as, competing with one another the way animals do, like sort of hunting over prey or something like that. But plants are always competing with one another for sunlight. And if, the water is looking pretty crowded, if you can survive on land, you get access to sunlight before the rest of the competition. That's a huge advantage. Not only is there less competition for light, there's more light itself. Water absorbs a lot of energy from light, and having access to that outside of the water just gives you more energy. And another advantage is, at first, there's no one trying to eat you on land like there is in the water. Don't get me wrong, land-based herbivores will evolve eventually, but at first, hey, if you're able to survive on land as a plant, that's a really great place to be. So there are some challenges that come with trying to survive on land if you're a plant. One of these is you need to not dry out. So you need some protection for your plant body so that evaporation doesn't just kill you when the sun comes out. You also need a way to transport water. So if you look at just any old plant here, the green parts, the photosynthetic organs, are what actually needs water. Photosynthesis destroys H2O as part of its chemical reaction. If you're surrounded by water, you don't really need a transportation system across the plant. You just absorb water from your surroundings. But if you're going to live on land, well, the photosynthetic organs are usually, high up in the air, close to the sun, and the water is down because, gravity. They're located in different places. So if you're going to live on land, you want a way to transport the water from where it rests according to gravity to where it needs to be, the organs doing photosynthesis. You also need to support your weight. Again, you're not quite so weightless when you're on dry land compared to water. And here's a weird but important one. You need to do sexual reproduction. Sperm need to get to the eggs in some way. If you're in the water, your sperm can just swim to reach their eggs. But if you're on dry land, that doesn't always work. So despite all of these challenges, there are so many advantages to being able to survive on land that our first evolutionary innovation is the ability to survive on land. So all further groups are classified as land plants. So at this point, I want to go back to this phylogenetic tree. So these two were green algae. Everything else is a land plant. I do like this figure as a phylogenetic tree. Here is another figure that you may find useful to look at. It kind of shows the umbrella categories and the other umbrella categories and the other umbrella categories around that. So this may be useful for you. Chlorophytes, not pictured here, but these were charophytes. And yeah, I like that this says the land plants, and it's a big bar that goes over everything. All of these groups that we're going to talk about later in the chapter are under this umbrella of land plants. So just now, before we get into these more specific groups and subgroups and stuff of land plants, I'm going to talk about another life cycle. So because all land plants have what's called a haplodiplontic life cycle. It's another one of these. Don't be too scared. This is not nearly as complicated as what we learned in the fungi chapter. And we're not going to be relearning this every couple of minutes because this life cycle is something that all land plants have. So let's walk through these steps. So it's a circle. There's not really any beginning or end, but you'll notice that it's divided into two halves, the N and the 2N. And just once again, remember, N means haploid, one copy of each chromosome, and 2N means diploid, two copies of each chromosome. Because we are diploid, let's just start here arbitrarily. So the multicellular diploid structure, again, this is closest thing to what our bodies are, is called a sporophyte. It's called a sporophyte because it produces spores through the process of meiosis to go from diploid cell to haploid cells. Now, here's where it's different from what we do, because our haploid cells would be egg and sperm, and their whole job is to fuse. But these haploid spores go through several rounds of mitotic division and grow into a big multicellular gametophyte. This is kind of like a different, separate individual. These are both multicellular things. And we'll see in some groups of plants, this is like a different plant. This is a different individual than this one. But in other groups, they're just substructures, and sometimes they're microscopic. And so there are different ways that these look in different groups of plants, but there's always a sporophyte. In land plants, there's always a gametophyte. So the gametophyte is multicellular haploid. It's called a gametophyte because it makes gametes. Gamete is a word that just means egg or sperm. An egg is a type of gamete, a sperm is a type of gamete. Gametophyte makes haploid gametes. And the difference between these haploid gametes and these haploid spores is that the job of the spores is just to divide and grow. The job of a gamete is to fuse together. Egg plus sperm equals zygote, a single-celled, we're back to diploid, cell that's going to divide and bring us back to being a multicellular diploid sporophyte. This is a great figure visually to look at, maybe to draw yourself to make sure that you've got it down, but here's the text summarizing this. Sporophyte multicellular diploid makes spores. The spores are unicellular haploid. It does this by meiosis. The spores divide by mitosis to form this gametophyte, which is multicellular and haploid. The gametophyte makes unicellular gametes, eggs or sperm, as the case may be, by mitosis. Then egg and sperm get together somehow to make this zygote, a single-celled diploid. Then the zygote divides by mitosis to form the sporophyte, and we are back to where we started. So, what you may be wondering in all of this is, where's the plant? which one is the plant? What am I looking at here when I walk around outside and look at a tree or look at a bush or look at a blade of grass? Well, depending on what group of plants we're talking about, sometimes the sporophyte is the prominent form, the plant that you would identify, and this is some tiny structure that's easy to miss. But in other groups, this is the plant, and this is some secondary structure that only exists to release spores. We'll come to these, as we get to them, but I want to point out either the sporophyte or the gametophyte may be the prominent form, depending on what we're talking about. Okay, now let's get into land plants. So the earliest land plants are a group called bryophytes. So earliest land plants were bryophytes. They can live on land, but they're not good at it yet. So we're going to see they have several limitations. These are not the most effective land plants, but quite a few of them are still alive today and have survived. So if we want to identify bryophytes, here it is. So we've got several more divisions of plants. This is not a monophyletic group. It's three separate groups that we sort of put under this umbrella of early land plants. And here it is on this figure. The bryophytes, sort of this umbrella, still under land plants. Liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. So bryophytes, not a clade. Another name for bryophytes is to refer to these as non-vascular plants. You may have noticed this here. Yep, non-vascular is describing these bryophytes. They're defined by what they don't have. They don't have vascular tissue to transport water and nutrients. That was one of those challenges to life on land. Spoilers, we're going to achieve vascular tissue soon enough, but in these bryophytes, there's no transportation. As a result, they can't grow very large. These bryophytes have to be pretty small. So what do they look like? Well, they kind of look like a flat, small leaf, but we can't call this a leaf. Technically, a leaf has to have vascular tissue for transporting nutrients and stuff. This structure that looks like a leaf is called a phallus. And these little structures that kind of look like roots are not real roots. Real roots transport water and mineral nutrients from the soil to the rest of the plant. Again, there's no vascular tissue here, so there's no transportation. These root-like structures are called rhizoids. So no leaves, these things called thalli do photosynthesis. No roots, these rhizoids anchor them to the ground. You may have also noticed that this thallus here, this big photosynthetic structure, is the gametophyte, 1N. There are sporophytes that exist. You see them sort of sticking up here in this generic bryophyte. They exist pretty much just to release spores. So in bryophytes, we can say that the gametophyte is the prominent plant. The sporophyte exists, obviously, but it's a smaller, sort of more secondary structure. Another thing to look at in these bryophytes is their sexual reproduction. So we talked about gametes or gametophytes producing gametes. Here is a gametophyte producing sperm in this particular male structure, and here is a female structure producing an egg. Note how they are both on the same plant. This plant is not male, this plant is not female. It has a male structure, it has a female structure where egg and sperm are produced. Not all bryophytes are like that though. Sometimes a bryophyte is distinctly male or distinctly female. Here is a thallus that only has a male structure and only makes sperm. And here is a different individual, a bryophyte that is, you could call female because it only has this female structure and only makes eggs. So there's a lot of detail labeled on here that I don't want you to stress out about. The statement I want to make, though, is that eggs and sperm are produced by the gametophyte, of course, on distinct structures. These can either be on the same plant, making both, or they can be on different distinct male and female plants. Another thing that you maybe noticed about these sperm in all these figures are the flagella coming off of these sperm. So I said one of the challenges to life on land is that sperm need to somehow get to their egg. Well, the flagella imply that swimming is happening. And yep, that's exactly what this caption says here. The sperm swims into the female structure and fertilizes the egg. Well, how are you gonna swim if you're on dry land? Well, you can swim if you're on dry land, but it has to be very humid, or it has to rain, it has to be very wet. So sperm swim using flagella to get to their eggs. Because of this, because they rely on swimming for fertilization, these bryophytes can only reproduce in environments where there's enough water for swimming to happen. So again, these are the earliest land plants. They're not good at it yet. These bryophytes need to live in moist, humid environments where it rains a lot because they can't reproduce if there's not water around. Okay, let's look at the three groups of bryophytes: liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Up first, we've got liverworts. So apparently, to some ancient person or group of people, the thalli in some of these liverworts looked like a liver. I guess I kind of see it, but anyway, if you're curious, that's why they're called liverworts. Someone thought they looked like a liver. So what's their deal? Well, we saw some of them in our typical life cycle things, but what I want to focus on about liverworts in particular are these structures called gemme cups. So we talked about sexual reproduction and sperm swimming to egg and all of that fun stuff. But in addition to that, liverworts produce these little cups on their thalli that are able to detach from the thallus. And remember, these things are living in environments where it rains a lot. And so when it rains, these cups can detach, and because they're like little boats, they're going to float on the rainwater, they're going to flow away somewhere else, and then they're going to grow into a new plant into a new gametophyte. So this is a form of asexual reproduction. So liverworts have gemme cups that detach and float away in the rain, grow into a new gametophyte. And yep, that's asexual reproduction. All right, that's all I wanted to say about liverworts. Moving on to hornworts. They're called hornworts because, well, okay, yeah, that checks out. They kind of look like horns to me, or spikes or something like that. So this one makes a little bit more sense. We can see labeled here that there are these big flat thalli. Remember, it looks like a leaf, but it's a thallus. And we see a bunch of these sporophytes, the horns sort of sticking up. This is what we were looking at in this sort of life cycle figure here. The thallus is this big prominent photosynthetic structure, and this sporophyte sticks up from this to release spores. And yeah, you want to be tall, just we saw this with fungi as well. You want to be tall if you're releasing spores. It helps the spores go further. So hornworts have a tall, thin sporophyte horn that helps to disperse spores. And the third group of bryophytes is called mosses. And yep, I think we've all familiar with mosses. We've seen these before. You can find these on campus if you keep a close eye out walking around. If you were to inspect this green fuzz a little bit more closely, you would see that it's a tangle of a bunch of individual filaments. And yeah, I like the quotes, quote unquote leaves, quote unquote stem. Again, they're not real leaves. It's not a real stem, and these are definitely not real roots, but they're fulfilling those functions. And it's just a bunch of these tangles growing together, producing from a distance what looks like green fuzz. And also, if you get up close and personal with some of these moss, you may see this structure sticking up out of them, which houses the sporophyte, which produces spores. It's the same reasoning behind why the sporophytes were these tall horns here in hornworts. The mosses producing these structures that stick up tall help release their spores, help the spores travel further. So to describe mosses, I can say many gametophyte filaments tangle together to produce what looks like a single moss, but really it's a bunch of individuals. And there are stalks that elevate the sporophytes to help disperse their spores. Okay, we are definitely not done with plants, but we've made some good headway into this. This is where I'm going to end things for this lecture. This is the end of recorded lecture 2.2.